That was a killer episode.
I was going to ask, was that good?
It's so good. Hello and welcome to Storyweavers, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything story related.
Here, we'll delve into inspiration, plot, structure, character, and dialogue. Be it in books, movies, music, comics, television, or anything else, we'll be covering it from conception to reception.
We'll be discussing between ourselves as well as with other creators and fans about their experiences, routines, and techniques. Join us and find your next inspiration. We're your hosts, Dean Bradley
and John William Worth.
And this is Storyweavers.
Everything is so subjective, but like how you just said about numbers, you can't lie about 4 apples being 4 apples.
Yeah.
Which is so interesting because then you get someone like me and you who are very much into storytelling, which is very language based last time I checked.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I do not have a head for numbers. And yet if you really think about it, numbers and mathematics, they're the one universal language.
Yeah.
And it's the idea that I'd be talking at like a kindergarten level at that point.
Yeah.
Actually, less than that.
I'm not going to comment.
Thank you very much. You've saved my ego.
All right. Well, this is actually a very good segue into what we wanted to discuss today.
Oh, we're recording. Surprise.
Which is the differences in the different mediums of storytelling. Mm-hmm. We were just talking about history and what's real and what's not real and what's inferred and yada, yada, yada. If you think about the history of storytelling, mm-hmm. the earliest known ways that humans probably communicated was through language.
Yes.
And it was probably through spoken word.
Well, I mean, I've actually... So sorry to butt in on the thought, but it's like I actually watched a video once, like a few weeks or possibly months ago, about languages and like very ancient languages, because ancient history is intriguing to me. And one of the concepts was the idea of a proto-language, like mm-hmm. the language that all others came from. And I think they said, obviously, it was a professor they were speaking to, we'll never know what a proto-language actually sounds like.
It would be interesting. I don't even know if
They said mostly it would be like grunts and like right. Those kinds of stuff.
Yeah,
very
but I guess,
simplistic.
but a lot of that also depends on like where those communities were, in early human populations, were they in, not the Mediterranean.
Africa, Middle East.
Yeah, were
that's
they in Africa? Were they in the Middle East?
The cradle of life, cradle of civilization.
Fertile Crescent. That's the word I was
yes.
looking for. Yeah, mm-hmm. So whether it was like Africa or the Fertile Crescent, or they had traveled east, over to where like modern day China is. It could be that there was a communication, and there probably was communication, some form of communication before they like separated and, went off into their own communities and things like that. But long story short, point being that earliest stories were probably told via the spoken word. And
or
of
pictures.
And pictures, yes, that's where I was headed next. Yeah, and pictures, cave drawings. The big difference between those two to me is that one of them is much more malleable than the other. They're open to interpretation because we don't speak the language of those cave drawings, but usually they're pretty representative, and you can usually tell what they're going to mean, until you get into like Egyptians and stuff like that, where some of the stuff is a little more, you get like hieroglyphs and things that are
a little
more actually like language based and not picture based.
Yes. Or where the pictures properly represent a thing or a verb or a concept. Right.
But whereas stories, spoken stories, telling someone a story over time is much more likely to change and become fantastical. I don't know how many, we don't know how many stories of early ancient civilizations were actually like, quote, folk tales or fairy tales. Most
right.
of them was probably telling about what happened, that field over there is not a good field because I had this experience, and maybe we should go this way because of some other experience I had. But over time, as languages develop and stories keep being told, and the people that hear the stories and retell them, they add their own twists and turns to them and make them a little more exciting. Whereas those cave drawings, they're still there thousands of years later.
Right. They're
And
hunting buffalo.
right, yeah. And we assume that's what it means. They're hunting buffalo. But
Right.
that painting doesn't change. And
Right.
that's kind of the same way with with films and things like that. Books are different because books change language.
Yes.
Books are translated, meaning can be lost. We can see the most famous text of all time being, the Christian Bible.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of resources and documentation about how the text of the Bible has evolved over time, and there have been different translations from ancient Aramaic and all of these things. And we've also learned that many of those texts were changed for political reasons,
Yes.
and things
Very
like
much
that.
so. We're seeing that in the current day too. And like talking about the Bible, I know like when I was little, my parents gave me like a children's version, not of the Bible, but like a bunch of the stories from the Bible, like Noah and Jesus. Obviously, kind of like toned down for
Yeah. Yeah,
children.
but I mean,
And
the
at least
kids'
that was
stories, and honestly, I mean, the Bible's a great source
it's
of
it's
like
a bunch of
stories and
the
tales
way
like that
I
of
read
the
it.
ancient world.
The way I read it was like it's a collection of short stories and it teaches you morals, and that's the whole
Yep.
point of it. It's just and what you were speaking about earlier, like how text changes over time. You made me think of like the oldest known written work, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which unfortunately I haven't read yet. The Iliad, the Odyssey, even the Legends of King Arthur. It's like those are probably all based very much in reality, but over time they grew to like these mythical and fictional proportions. Just like, King Arthur's probably the most famous. I mean, the Iliad and the Odyssey are famous, but King Arthur, he's the most famous. And when we think about it, it's like the Lady in the Lake. We think of Excalibur. We think of, all of the fantastical elements, finding the Holy Grail. And we think of knights in shining armor. In reality, the time when King Arthur would have taken place, he would have been decked out in animal furs. They would have had giant orgies and giant drinking parties, and they would have lived in mounds. So
Yep.
it's like over time, you got this very romanticized version of King Arthur, but it is based in fact. So it's just like
Yeah.
how you
But
said, language changes with time and with people.
yeah. Well, what I think is interesting to think about with King Arthur, and there probably is, I'm sure someone has looked into this and I'm just ignorant of the subject, but like how much of the legend of King Arthur came after his time, or how much of it came from people that heard about him and his achievements during his time and thought that it was much more and much bigger than what it was. And then, King Arthur and his knights and the people around him, he's getting all this renown. Why correct them? Why correct
Exactly.
people and tell them that they're wrong? It
Yep.
makes you look, he turned into one of the most legendary figures in all of history, at least like Western history.
Right. It's like I know I've actually researched this because my mom was fascinated with King Arthur and Arthurian legend, and I am too, to an extent. The earliest known mention of King Arthur was, I think, in the Historia Britannica or something, and it was like in the 1400s, at least 100 years after Arthur could have existed. It was this brief mention that said, "Oh, King Arthur did this,"
Yeah.
and that leads to the idea that, yeah, King Arthur probably wasn't the greatest king. He was just a very good king, and he did something that made him noticeable. And then the legend grew from that. And, it's all about, as time went on, the most famous version of King Arthur is what's known as Sir Thomas Mallory's version, I think written in like the 1500s. I might be completely wrong with these dates, but Sir Thomas Mallory was a prisoner in a French prison at the time when he wrote this giant, like 800-page epic. And, you can't say that imprisonment, his lifestyle, whether or not he was a good or bad person, because you can't say that didn't influence the story and change it with the time. So it was his perception of the legend at that time. That's where all the
Right.
chivalry came from. That's where all like the knights and the way ladies are supposed to behave and all this stuff that we think of now was from that very romantic version written by a prisoner.
Right. Yeah. So I think
Yeah.
that that's just one of the interesting things when it comes to storytelling and how they're being told. To me, like, the stories are great, but I almost find more enjoyment in trying to find the origins of the story, what was going on with the creator at the time, what was happening in their life, whether personally or socially, what big, movements were happening at the time, whatever it is.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times that will influence how you read and receive the story.
Yes, exactly.
And
Like,
it's good. A lot of times it's good to just take a story like on its head, or on at its face, and this is the story and this is what it is and these are the lessons it teaches us. Um, but there had to have been a reason that this person wanted to tell this story.
right, exactly. Like, if you want to rope it back to the Bible, you get all the morals because probably when the Bible was written, murder was much more common. Many crimes were probably, there were not many laws that were easily enforceable. And they were able, a lot of the stories they used in the Bible, like, I don't say this to demean any religion or any story in the Bible, but I almost compare them to Aesop's fables in some ways, where
Oh
it's like,
yeah.
yes, Aesop used animals, but they taught moral lessons. Noah, there was probably just like a flood in some part of the earth. He built a boat, and instead of animals, he might have saved a bunch of people, or a bunch of animals might have hopped onto the boat and not attacked him, like Life of Pi, because, survival of the fittest. And it's like the animals recognize, hey, you built this boat. You're a good guy.
Yeah.
Same with Jesus. Jesus might have been more of a political activist than the Son of God, but because he was so strong in his beliefs, he attained a kind of prophet. Like, what kind of word would you
I
use?
mean,
Like,
yeah, I guess you could call him a prophet in some sense. I don't know if that's the
yeah,
the correct term,
he
but
took on a
yeah.
larger than life shape in the story in the
Yeah.
Bible,
And
and that
and
doesn't
pissed off the
lessen.
government.
Right, and it's like that doesn't, like, how the government uses religion now, but it's like that doesn't lessen the actual person
Right.
who was
I
Jesus,
had
who
I
was
dated a
Noah.
I dated a girl once, and her mom wasn't religious, but she was spiritual. And I remember one of the
Hmm.
things she said that always like resonated with me was like, yeah, I'm not sure I really believe that Jesus was the son of God and all of this stuff, but I'll tell you one thing. He sounds like he was a cool dude and he loved people, and I would have definitely drank wine with him.
Exactly. It's like they say that all the time, like with, people of, because Jesus was not white if he really existed, everyone. Um, how, condemning, condemning other races, condemning LGBT people, condemning transgender people. It's like you realize that if Jesus is real or was real, he would happily sit at a table with all of these people. And anyway, I don't want to get too political, but it's that idea that it's kind of attractive to me that a normal person, a normal man born of man and woman, man or God, whatever, it's like he could attain this kind of power because of his beliefs or her beliefs. Like a good film that shows this off, is The Last Temptation of Christ. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
I don't think I have.
It's Martin Scorsese. It's a superb film because Martin Scorsese is a devout Catholic. And he made this film basically with Willem Dafoe playing Jesus, and a bunch of his friends like Harvey Keitel and everyone. So it's very
Oh yeah,
common
stacked
dialogue.
cast.
And it portrays Jesus as a normal person with normal fallibilities. Like, he's afraid, he's nervous. The final scene, because spoiler, he gets crucified,
Oh,
is
damn it,
him.
John.
I know, it's only been, 2,000 years.
Snape kills
I,
Dumbledore.
that's a lot more recent. But at the end scene, Willem Dafoe's Jesus decides to give in to the Romans. And he has a happy life with Mary Magdalene. You find out this is all imagined, that in the end he did go through with it. He is crucified. But it's like the movie was so controversial because it showed Jesus being a normal person. And to me,
Yeah.
that made it so much more powerful because it's like,
Well, it's more relatable.
exactly, because it's like Alan Rickman talking in Dogma to, during the lake
Oh,
scene, which I
yes.
love that movie. He
Yes.
says, it broke my heart to have to tell this scared little boy that in order to save humanity, he would have to die. And it's like that humanization, if that's a word, of this
Of course it
mythical
is.
figure. instead of making it less powerful, it actually makes it more powerful because it makes you realize I could do that. My
Right.
neighbor could do that. My friend could do that. It's like, it gives it even more power.
Agreed.
Yes.
Wholeheartedly. Yeah. So yeah, no, it's interesting how the Bible is such a it's a great source of so many things to discuss, even if, you don't want to take it on its face as history.
Right.
There's so much that can be learned and gained morally and, so many different ways. That, even if you're not religious, reading parts of the Bible and reading the history of the Bible and when it was written and how it was changed is a really fantastic way to kind of look at how stories can evolve over time. And part of it too is like, why were these books written? Why were these stories told? And oftentimes it's probably because, like, as you mentioned before, everyone was in small communities and, maybe, I would assume something like, pork being, dirty and not wanting to eat it. They basically were telling people don't eat the pork, probably because it's disease ridden and people were dying.
Right.
But if you
Or
told
like a
someone
vendor
back
across the
then,
street was selling pork for cheaper. So it's like, oh, don't buy pork,
yeah, right, or it could have been that, yeah, like we don't know. It could have been any number of things, but it also could have just been like a basic safety measure, like that meat's dirty, people are getting sick, but we can't stop we can't stop people from eating it, so we'll tell them that God told them it's bad to do it, you know, because people will believe that.
I would have the suspicion, like, why I'm attracted to the written word and why I would call myself an author even above a filmmaker, even though I went to school and spent a lot of money doing it. Because it's that certain influence that the written word has, the implication that it's almost like the Bible, like it's like a religious text.
Okay, we just want to take a brief moment to remind everybody about our book of the month this month. For this month, we are going to be reading The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson. So this takes place in around 1939, 1940.
1941, I think.
Yeah.
To early 1941.
And focuses on Winston Churchill as he becomes Prime Minister of England at the beginning of World War II and the impending German invasion of Britain and the London bombings. And we get a nice view into Churchill and his family's personal lives. We get a little glimpse into some of the personal lives of high-ranking members of the Third Reich and the Nazis, and we get a nice view of some Londoners in London. This is a nonfiction book, but it is written similar to in the style of a narrative. It is designed to read like a story, but it is nonfiction. But I guarantee you it is not dry. I'm a little bit into it so far, and it's absolutely fantastic.
As a slow reader myself, I'm actually proud. I've been keeping pace with Dean pretty well for this book of the month. I think I'm on page about 200, 250 at this point. And I'm not as big of a nonfiction reader, but I am an Erik Larson fan, and I love his work. I can agree this is definitely not a dry read. It's super insightful and very entertaining.
Yeah, so we will get back to our episode now, but we just wanted to give you that quick reminder. This month we are reading The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson.
In a way, and the Bible definitely influenced me turning to writing,
Yeah. Well, writing, I think, is much more, it's also much more personal than, say, filmmaking is, just in the sense that when it comes to writing, for the vast majority of written stories, they're written by one person from that one person's perspective at that time in their life.
Right.
Whereas a lot of times with movies and films, especially ones with larger budgets, you want to tell your story, but you have to satisfy, you have to find actors that'll tell your story correctly. You need to have producers and investors that are willing to, give you money to tell your story. And if they're giving you the money, they may tell you, well, if you want my money, you have to tell it this way or do it this way. And oftentimes that type of collaboration has incredible consequences in a good way, in the fact that, it ends up being something more than you were expecting it to be, or you found ways to look at it from a different perspective, and that influenced, how you created the film.
Right. It's not always the case. I mean, like Orson Welles is famous for this, that a lot of his movies after Citizen Kane, starting with The Magnificent Ambersons, were tinkered with by studios. And they were very, very business, very money oriented. And you definitely saw that because they catered to who they saw as the lowest common denominator, a common phrase in the film industry. Oh, it'll play in Pomona, because Pomona was a big town, I think, in California, where they always did the test screenings.
Oh.
And studios would, if they didn't like the filmmaker, they would purposely get the opposite crowd from who the film was targeted. Like The Magnificent Ambersons, it was test screened in front of a bunch of young people, teenagers, who felt the film was slow. It was a downer. It needs more laughs. So the studio used that against the filmmaker. And I've heard other stories of, I believe it was one of Mike Nichols' movies. I think it might have been The Graduate, or one of his comedies, The Birdcage, where again the test audience hated it, and Mike Nichols just straight up looked at the studio and said, "Screw you! This is the way it's working," and it worked.
Yeah.
But no, like you're right.
Trust your artists, people.
Exactly, because you're right about the film. It's much more of a collaborative effort. And at least when I personally write stories, if it's very personal or something like I want the reader, the audience to know, I will turn it into a book. If it's something, I hate to say it, a little less personal or a little more like, fun, or it's definitely more of a visual medium, I'll write it as a script, knowing that scripts are much more difficult to produce. With a book, your imagination is the limit.
Yeah. They're also much more interpretive, too.
Oh, yes, very much so.
When you're writing, there's so much more you can include in setting a scene or setting a tone or setting a headspace of a character or, their past that may not necessarily come across in a film unless you either somehow explicitly state it or find ways to implicitly show it and hope that your viewer is able to pick up on those little cues.
Exactly. And to an extent, like when I was, because I'm a huge Watchmen fan, when the movie came out, one of the biggest criticisms, because the original author of the comics hates adaptations of his films, he said the problem with films is that they're moving at 24 frames or 30 frames or 60 a second. With comics or a book, you can reread a passage, you can look at the picture, you can study it. With a film, it's over.
Right.
Snap of the fingers, it's over. So it doesn't give you that depth. Just like you said, everything that's implicit in a book has to become explicit to a degree.
Now, on the other side of that, though, it is much less time-consuming to watch a movie multiple times than it is to read the book multiple times.
Right.
But at the same time, when you're reading a book, you're expecting it to take a while. And depending on the book you're reading, maybe you're taking notes, maybe you're highlighting things, maybe you don't care about what's going on underneath. But a lot of that stuff is going to be much more on the surface and told to you in a book than it would necessarily be in a film.
It's just like how I noticed like a bunch of artists, like most that I know of, have dabbled in other fields as well, because it gives them that perspective so that they know what can work in one, what can work in another, and maybe there's a little bit of carryover. Like I know that a poetry professor in college once told me, she noticed with my poems and then with my written work, she was like, you construct them like you construct a film. Like every line is a new shot, if you will. And I looked at it, I was like, oh yeah, you're kind of right. Like I didn't realize that before, but I was unintentionally structuring it like a film. And even my scripts were like that, except there it was a little bit more acceptable. Same with like, artists like draw people who draw, like I think Joanne Lindsay, the author of A Picnic at Hanging Rock, she was also a painter. And that definitely influenced her work because it's very scenic. It's very beautiful. I don't know if you have any experience with that, going back and forth between different mediums, but
not me personally. I mean, I'm mostly in the reading, whether it's fiction, nonfiction novels, history, science textbooks, whatever, or music. Though that being said, like my favorite bands are progressive rock and progressive metal bands, and most of those bands' albums are all concept albums and tell a story. And I think what I find really fascinating about those, take for instance Coheed Cambria, who is my favorite band. My dog's name is Cambria. Um,
Good girl.
the thing with them is like all of their albums, save for one. Um, let me go back a little bit. So their singer actually wasn't originally tending to have a band. He started out writing comics online and releasing them online called the Bag Online Adventures. Um, and eventually it grew into this story called the Amory Wars. And then
I've
like
heard of
some
those, yeah.
friends of his from like high school, I don't know if they were in high school or college when they started, but they decided to, get a band together and write music. And for lyric wise, he basically just took stories and quotes and lines from his comics and wrote songs about them. And so a lot of people who are familiar with Coheed and Cambria and know that they do comics and things like that don't necessarily realize that like the comics actually came first, and then he created music to go along with it, and then they blew up and ended up on MTV. But when you watch interviews with them now, it's interesting because a lot of times what he does now is he'll write songs and lyrics that are personal and about what's been going on in his life. And then he basically writes a story. He kind of is able to like sequence the songs and create a story that fits within this narrative that he's written over all of the other albums. So it kind of started off with him creating his own story and narrative, and then for fun creating music. And now, like, he's a songwriter who then takes those and creates a continuous narrative, based on the last one, and he finds ways to make it fit. Sometimes he changes lyrics so that it, fits into the sci-fi fantasy story and things like that. But it's cool and interesting. Like they're a band that a lot of people listen to and don't know. I mean, it's hard not to know that some of their albums are concept albums with their song titles and things like that. But a lot of people don't care about those overarching stories because the songs themselves are great songs and they
They can
tell
stand
their
on their
own
own.
stories, within them. The first like couple albums have a lot of direct references to the comics in terms of names of characters and actual like scenes that happen. But as you move on, a lot of the songs don't necessarily have those same story elements. And I think that just came with his evolution as a writer and a songwriter and things like that.
It all fed into each other almost, and
Right.
it influenced each other. And that made him better at everything, I would say, because he took
Yeah.
bits and pieces from other mediums and was like, okay, this will work here, this will
Yeah.
work there. I find it incredible how much a songwriter, a musician can put into a song, be it a 3-minute song or an entire album. It's just so incredible when you hear like how much emotion and the buried feelings that they managed to put in there, and then you understand it. Because music, like how we were talking about earlier, music is mathematics to an extent.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, like
It's
you can
all
play
it's all harmonies and harmonics.
exactly. It's that combination between the hard logic of the universality of math and then the emotion and the interpretation of language. And it's something that I myself could never imagine doing because to me it seems like such a complex and intricate thing. The fact that anyone can do it is just incredible. And then over an
Well,
entire concept album and tell an entire story
yeah.
is like,
But I mean, but
whoa.
it's also like I mean, it's like storytelling in any other medium. You don't have to be a writer. You don't have to know grammar and understand all of the words in the English language to be able to write something good.
Right.
You'll have more
Just be like
options
Mel
available.
Brooks.
You'll have yeah.
Just hum into a microphone.
Yeah. You'll have more options to you. But some of the greatest songwriters don't know how to read music. They don't know what all the notes are. They literally just picked up the instrument and heard notes that sounded good together.
Yeah.
And what we've kind of learned over time is that a lot of those things everyone feels the same way about them.
Yeah.
They say in Spinal Tap D minor is the saddest of all keys. And at least
Oh,
with
yeah.
Western music, or you talk to people that grew up with Western music, you play a D minor chord, most people will probably tell you that it sounds sad.
Mel Brooks, it's like he very famously, for the producers, he can't write music, but he wanted to write the song, so he would hum into the microphone what he thought the music should sound like. He would write the lyrics, and then he would collaborate with a composer to turn his humming
Oh,
into music. And I was
cool.
like, okay, it's like this inherent knowledge of, because it's all about beat, it's all about rhythm and math. So it's like
Hmm.
it's inherently human in a way to want to go to a rhythm. We're
Right.
repetitious.
But yeah, I mean, it's just, and there's something magical, whether it's a music or film or a movie or whatever it is. But when, like, just when all of it comes together, when you have the compelling story, when you
Yeah.
have some basis in reality that that story came from, and then the actual medium it's being told in, whether it's good writing or really well done filmmaking, or
Yeah.
a catchy song that either stays with you or is epic. It's when all of those things come together, like that's
Yeah.
when, like, stories really capture me. You can have a great story, or you can have great writing with the boring story, or you can have, whatever it is, you can
A
have
boring
really
story with great
really
writing.
really good actors that are delivering lines really well, but the writing was bad or whatever it is. And there's a
Right.
lot of instances of that, and there are plenty of those things that I love.
I mean,
But the
it's
ones that stick with you
yep,
are the
it's the
ones that have
universality
all of
of
it.
the universality of the music and what you feel. Because what was it recently? I mean, I knew about the song before. Johnny Cash's "Hurt." I'm
Oh
sure
yeah.
you've,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
I know the history
it's
behind that, but I'll let you go.
it's like it was written by Nine Inch Nails, I believe
Yeah,
Trent Reznor,
Trent Reznor
and he
wrote
wrote
it.
it. I think about drug addiction. I think it
Mm-hmm.
was like, and Johnny Cash like hit him up one day and was like, "Hey, yeah, I want to sing this song," and he was like, "Really? Okay." I mean, that's one of those things you don't say no to. It's like if Steven Spielberg say, "Hey, I want to adapt one of your
Yeah.
books," I was like, "Go ahead."
Yeah. But do you know what happened after that then?
Yeah, it's like Johnny Cash sang the song. He only changed one word. He changed "shit" to "dirt," which to me
Correct.
made the song more powerful,
Yeah.
almost. And then Trent Reznor got the tape, and because Johnny Cash was like, I guess, within a year of dying, and he got the tape of the song, and Trent Reznor said he listened to it, and he said it was like watching someone else screw his girlfriend, and she was enjoying it because it's like it was like he said it did draw tears from his eyes, but he realized like, wow, he just made this song better. And then
Mm-hmm.
he got the music video, which I will admit I teared up watching it.
Mm-hmm.
And even Trent Reznor was like, he broke down, and his famous line was, "The song isn't mine anymore."
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. He
Yep.
basically, like he wrote it, and he wrote it based on his experiences, and then yeah, Johnny Cash, from a completely different genre and era of music,
Yes.
comes in, gets his permission, does a cover of it, and it's so good that the original artist is basically like, okay, I may have wrote that song, but it's not my song anymore.
Right. And it's like, yeah,
What a feeling.
it's, I know, like even just watching it as like the viewer, it's like, it's a very powerful music video, very powerful song, but then you know the history behind it, and it somehow
Hmm.
makes it even stronger.
Yeah.
And
It also must have been very frustrating for Trent too, because it's a popular, not
mhm,
one of the most popular Nine Inch Nails songs, but like it's a well-known Nine Inch Nails song. It ends, Downward Spiral, which is a really, kind of seminal album for industrial music. Um, but like, to have written it and have something that was already well known and good, and then to be like, wow, someone did it better.
you're possessive of it because it's just like when I was in film school making films, or even like my books now, if someone else were to come along and remake it or something, it would feel almost like a violation to an extent.
Would
Like
well
someone
would
was
it would
taking,
it still feel like a violation, if it wasn't very good?
yes, I
But
would
you
say
wouldn't
so,
care. But you
because
wouldn't care as much because
I
you
wouldn't
would
care as
still.
much, but it would be like a little stain
Yeah.
on the reputation. If it was better, I would be torn. And this is coming personally because, again, it's like, again, if Steven Spielberg said he wanted to adapt one of my books or adapt a short film I made, I would say yes, of course. But at the same time, it would also be tough watching it
Yeah.
Like I've actually had this thought because I've had one or two people ask like, oh, can we option your books for film rights or TV rights? It's one of those things I would have to physically not physically literally, but step away from the production and say, look, I want nothing to do with it because it's not mine. I already wrote it.
Right.
And
I already gave you
I
my
know
story. You know, if you want to
exactly.
tell your story how you want to tell it.
Right. And I feel like that's also
unless you specifically wanted, to do a movie adaptation or a film adaptation of one of your books and you had creative control over it. That's a different
right.
story. But if someone comes to you and wants to tell it their way, you wouldn't really want anything to do with it.
Essentially.
Necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's
I get that.
Unless it was like, it would depend on the story to an extent, but like, say all the Nocturne novels that I've written, The Boy Unstuck in Time, it's like you would have to physically pry my nails up from my fingers to get me to even collaborate on the screenplay, because like advising, yes, but I would be very hesitant because it's like I would be afraid to step on the director's toes, to step on someone's toes, because it's like it's at that point it's no longer mine. It's just like Trent Reznor. He wrote the original Hurt, and it was his feelings. And the way Johnny Cash interpreted it, it was Johnny Cash's feelings. So it's like, that's probably why he's much more honored to have had it done than violated to an extent, because it's like, it's not invalidating the old song.
Right.
It's the recognition that, okay, someone else saw something in my lyrics and they wanted to do it. It wasn't offensive. It wasn't derogatory towards that original intent. It was something different.
And what I find interesting, and I don't know if it's unique or not, but what I find really interesting about your take is that it wouldn't be from a jealousy perspective, which is what I would have maybe assumed from a lot of writers who were having their works adapted into a different medium. You wouldn't want to be involved, not because you would be jealous that it would be better, but because you've already gotten out what you've wanted to put out. You've already written it. You've told your story, and you would be okay with someone telling the story, but your reasonings for being hesitant wouldn't be because of jealousy or worrying about your reputation necessarily, because you already did what you wanted to do. And I think that's a really interesting point, because a lot of times adaptions are not done for those reasons. A lot of times they're done for money. Right.
Yep. I mean, like, I know that some authors do get possessive, but they're very much in the minority from what I understand. Like, I think of stories from like The Color Purple, which is a fantastic book by Alice Walker. And, Steven Spielberg, who is a very white director, but very good. He directed the film, superb film. But she was very hesitant about having him direct it. And when she saw what she called Oklahoma style opening, she was like appalled, because she was like, what is this man doing to my baby? And that's the way I think of like even my stories. It's like, they're my children. It's like that whole thing, like in order to write a book, you cut a vein open and bleed on the page. It's like, to an extent that is, because you're giving a pound of flesh of yourself and you're putting it out into the world. And it's that idea that someone might squander it or someone might misinterpret it. That's really where that whole feeling comes from. And that's, once again, tying it back to Johnny Cash and Trent Reznor. That's probably why Trent Reznor was like, bowing at the altar to an extent, because he didn't damage the reputation. He didn't damage the song. He improved it. And it's like, as purely as an artist, not as, someone who's in it for the money, as an artist, you can appreciate that.
That's got to feel great.
Yes, it's an honor, and it's also like you're taking something that you slaved away at, and you didn't, shit all over it. You didn't invalidate it. You made it even better, and your name is still attached to it, but you're now part of a legacy, of a legend.
Yeah, and this is why I want to do an episode on Joseph Campbell at some point.
Yes, the hero with 1,000 faces.
Yeah, we don't need to get into it right now. This episode's already getting kind of long. Especially because it's probably going to be the first episode.
We'd like to take a brief moment to thank you for listening to Storyweavers. For the enjoyment of our listeners, we want to keep this podcast ad-free and uninterrupted.
If you would like to support us further, check out our options on Patreon. Plus, subscribing will get you behind-the-scenes content, bloopers, access to Book of the Month polls, and more. We appreciate any and all support.
Now back to the episode.
but like Joseph Campbell's, like his research and his ideas were the fact that there is a common human experience, there are common human wants and needs, and while many people will say that most art is derivative, it's derivative because of all of these collective experiences, and because most of the things that people are expressing are
They're
things that
so
other
universal.
people, yeah, they're universal. Other people are as well. And then, but at the same time, you also have, to go back to like Hurt, originally being about like drug addiction. There are a lot of people that don't know what drug addiction's like. And a song like that gives you a glimpse of it.
Yes, exactly.
And that's something art can do, is it can let you experience something that you wouldn't ever or wouldn't want to experience yourself. But again, it's part of the
The
human
human
experience.
experience, because we all experience these things eventually. Like, we can look at something like, Taylor Swift. Everyone has a breakup. Everyone has their heart broken. Everyone can understand those lyrics, but it's like as you age, because you see her as she's making her songs, as she's aging, she interprets it all differently.
Hmm.
And it's interesting. And then you also get
She's
to the
also
more
taking a lot more control of her music as she gets older, which I
Taylor's version.
also, yeah, right, exactly, which
Yep.
I also like applaud very much, to coming out and
Very much
saying
so.
like, this was written, it was my stuff, but it was in a sense like corporatized and monetized, but this is me
Is
and this is what I
mine.
wanted, and now that I've made it, and now that people know who I am, I can show you what I wanted to do. And I think that's
Yep.
really cool that she's able to do that and people want to hear it.
Yeah, it makes artists feel valued, especially in a world like now where it's like we're told it's not valuable. Like, oh, art's not that big of a deal. Anyone can do it. It's not that big of a deal. But then you see something like this, how influential it is, how powerful it is, how important it can be. Because one of the other things I was going to say, you know, art can also teach you about things that could happen or will happen eventually, like the Book of Monster Calls.
Hmm.
I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Have you?
I've heard of it, but I'm not very
I
familiar
read it
with it.
years ago when my mom was first diagnosed with pulmonary hypertension, and it made me cry so much, but it was important because it's something every person will go through.
Right.
And it did help to an
Yeah.
extent. And the fact that you can take that universal, powerful and painful thing and turn it into a story, just means so much.
Yeah. I'm
Just like the breakup with Taylor Swift and all her
hmm
emotions, those are just as important.
Oh yeah, they're cathartic.
Yes, incredibly
It's
so.
cathartic, and there's something about making you feel okay because someone else has gone through it and made it through. It doesn't make it easier necessarily. Like, you still have to go through it, but
Yes,
there's something comforting about knowing that you're not the only one.
right.
And what
You
I want
took
I,
this.
I want to challenge our listeners, actually.
Yeah,
You made that comment that art or whatever is like kind of meaningless. Try and relate to somebody or how someone's feeling without telling a story. Stories can be real. Stories don't have to be fictional. But try
nonfiction.
relating to someone without telling a story. Well, it's not easy. It's not fun. It's not going to make
No,
for a good conversation. That person's probably not going to like you very much.
no, because you just
Everything comes back to stories. Art is just, it's a way of expressing those stories, and some people express it differently, and some people feel different things depending on the type of expression.
exactly. It's like to not to go on too long, but it's like I remember I see this all the time, and in psychology, our professor actually taught us about it. You'll be talking to someone, and sometimes you'll feel like they're always drawing the conversation back about themselves because they're telling, oh, I experience this, I experience that. That's not them trying to dominate the conversation or control everything. That's them relating to you. Because just like how you said, try understanding someone or conveying something without telling a story.
Yeah.
It's nigh impossible, because instead, oh, just cheer up, be happy, feel better. It's not as important. It's not as cathartic or
or
powerful.
it's not conducive
It's
to
condescending.
help really. Well, it can definitely come across as condescending. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like telling a story is I relate to you. I can understand this. This is what I experienced. And it does draw people together.
Yeah. Again, what we wanted to do with this episode is talk about the different mediums of storytelling and what all encompasses that, there are so many differences and ways to look at all different forms of storytelling. So like the next time you watch a movie or you pick up a book or you turn on your next TV show, like hop online and learn a little bit about the
About
creator
it.
and the creator's life and why they created it. And take some of those things in the back of your mind while you're experiencing this story. And I can almost guarantee that you'll probably appreciate it more and you'll see more of the creator in the story itself.
Yes, Wikipedia, IMDb, look up these facts, find out about the creator, the meaning behind certain things, and it will enrich almost every experience, even like horrible movies and unenjoyable books and maybe music you don't necessarily listen to all the time. You will learn so much more because you'll see
You'll
there's
find
actual.
appreciation.
Exactly. It's like you might not like what you hear or see or read,
But
but it will have weight. It will have
someone did.
meaning.
Someone did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that will improve your experience so much.
And that's what our goal at Storyweavers here is not just taking the stories on their surface, but like diving down and getting into the nitty-gritty, getting into the business of storytelling, getting into the psyche of storytelling, the everyday day-to-day work that goes into storytelling in the modern age, how it's changed over time, how politics have affected artists, things like that. Those are all
Everything.
things we want to talk about and cover in, over the course of this podcast. So hopefully what we discussed today was intriguing and you found something cool to think about. I know John mentioned multiple movies and books that I hadn't heard of that I'm now going to have to go check out. So we encourage you to do all of that. And we want to hear your thoughts. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Storyweavers.
Yes, thank you everyone, and we hope to see you again soon. Is that a good sign off?
That's fine. Whatever.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool.
I felt like I need to say something.